In Anglo-Saxon England, in the region of Northumbria, just off the coast, there is an island that later generations would call the Holy Island. It is the island of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was the site where a monastery was erected and where the English Saint Cuthbert was later interred. And the Lindisfarne Monastery was really one of the great centers of learning in Anglo-Saxon England, if not throughout the European world. And that learning culminated in or around the year 700 with the creation of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And this collection of the Gospels really is both symbolic for its artistic design, for its great care and precision for creating art along with the text of Scripture, but it's also the culmination of the learning of the Anglo-Saxon Christian world. And the Lindisfarne Gospels have a number of features to them that are very interesting. It's one of the best examples we have of what we call insular script or Hiberno-Saxon script, which for those who study ancient handwriting and manuscripts, it's the unique style of handwriting to this region. It's the style of writing and art we also see in the Book of Kells. And the Lindisfarne Gospels, of course, have all these intricate knot formations and these wonderful front pages to each of the Gospels that symbolize the author of each of the four Gospels, the four evangelists. And just a number of years after the completion of this manuscript, tragedy hit the Lindisfarne Monastery. As the monks were at work in the scriptorium, as they looked out over the sea, suddenly they saw ships on the horizon. And not being naturally scared of ships, being quite accustomed to seeing trade ships and other things coming over the sea, they were unprepared for what was about to happen. When the ships landed, it was a raiding party and not there on business or seeking anything from the monastery specifically. These were Vikings. They had come over from Scandinavia, and they were there to raid and steal from the monastery all of its prized possessions. Several of the monks were killed, and others were badly hurt or beaten or harassed, and then they had to flee. And this assault on the Lindisfarne Monastery, though there had been Viking raids before, for historians marks the beginning of the expansion of the Vikings. Now, the story of the Vikings is somewhat familiar to us, at least in terms of the popular understanding of the Vikings. Many of us can conjure up the image of a certain barbaric warrior, sometimes with horns on his head, though that's a legend that unfortunately was not true of the Vikings themselves, coming over on ships, getting off and raiding various areas of Europe. We also are probably familiar with the fact that the Vikings were the first to sail over to Iceland and then all the way over to Greenland and into the New World. They were the first Westerners to make it that far. But the story of the Vikings is an important story for the development of the Christian world in the West. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the Vikings, who they were, what was their context, and what was its role in shaping both the European world as a whole and in shaping the church. And we need to begin by just examining who the Scandinavian peoples were. The Scandinavians, of course, were people that came from the three countries known as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And that region, of course, is not exactly tropical. It is a very cold climate. In fact, in the early Middle Ages, Scandinavia was a bit of a bleak wilderness. It was covered with vast forests. In fact, there was very little arable land throughout the Scandinavian regions. And the Scandinavian peoples, in fact, relied very, very little on farming for their sustenance and for their diet. Often they took to the seas, they were fishermen, or they engaged in animal husbandry, which means that they raised livestock. Their diet consisted mostly of meat or milk or cheese or butter and fish as well thrown in. And in many ways, because of their diet, they were seen historically, and even down till today in popular understandings of the Vikings, as these kind of barrel-chested, strong, hulking characters who in many ways on a battlefield would dominate their other opponents. That history goes all the way back to the Roman world. When the Romans first encountered the Scandinavians, they described them as this sort of reddish hair, light-eyed, monstrous sort of imposing figure when they came across them. And of course, a lot of this for the Romans is snobbery. They consider the Vikings, as well as many of the Germanic peoples of the north, to be barbarians. But the Scandinavian world, I want to say, is not as remote and isolated and detached from Europe as we might be accustomed to assuming. The Scandinavian world was different because of the harsh, long winters and because of the ways in which their life just sort of evolved. They were not a city folk. They did not plant large cities that attracted more citizens to it, etc. In many cases, the Scandinavian peoples were clannish people. They often built great mead halls, usually built around a sacred tree or sacred oak, and life would sort of be lived in small clans, and those clans did not necessarily hold loyalties to the neighboring clan or to any sort of sense of national identity. But for all of its uniqueness, the Scandinavian world was not remote and isolated and all that different from its Celtic and its Anglo-Saxon neighbors. Of course, in the English Isles at this time, the rulers were the Anglo-Saxons, and the Anglo-Saxons, of course, have four kingdoms: the kingdom of Northumbria, of Mercia, of Wessex, and of Sussex. Over in the continent, you have the Frankish empires, who had come to dominate large amounts of terrain in the European world. But that Frankish empire sat on top of a pre-existent Celtic or Gothic way of life. And the Celtic world in this time is Gaul, that is modern-day France, certain parts of Germany, and the Netherlands. In all three of these regions, Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon England, and large amounts of the Celtic world during the Roman period, all share a common Germanic background. There is lots of trade between these cultures. There is not overt hostility that goes back centuries to some grievance in history's past. And so when we get to the Viking Age of expansion and raids and warfare, in many ways, it sort of comes out of the blue. When the Scandinavians come a Viking, as we say, they don't come to sort of settle old debts. Rather, what happens is almost collectively, they just embark on an expansionistic policy that will take them all around the known world. But again, to stress this, the backstory of Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic or Gothic world was quite intermeshed. And what happens, though, is with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, you have a marginalization or regionalization effect that occurs throughout much of Europe. We've already looked at the reigns of Charlemagne and the rise of the Carolingian Empire and how it attempted to sort of snatch up many of these regions on the continent. But there was a wider concern that occurs with the fall of Rome, and that is that in many ways, there is no imperial army to keep certain cultures and certain peoples at bay if they decide to use their military advantage or their strength to attack some others. And lastly, what happens is as you have Anglo-Saxons begin to convert to Christianity, and as you have the Frankish empires at least formally adopting Christianity, what you see happening in those two regions is you see a complex mixture of the old pagan ways of life and the new Christian ways that they are trying to sanctify culture, we might say. The greatest example of this is the epic Beowulf. And the epic Beowulf, of course, our knowledge of it has been expanded by the excavation of Sutton Hoo. If any of you have seen any of the modern publications of Beowulf, there's probably one of two images on it. It's either Beowulf's sword or it's the Sutton Hoo helmet that both come from the time of the writing of Beowulf. And of course, the story of Beowulf is relatively familiar to people. It's the story of the hero Beowulf, who goes to the kingdom of Denmark to help the king there defeat this monster that is terrorizing his clan, that is sneaking into the mead hall at night and stealing people away to eat them. And the monster, of course, is Grendel. But what's often forgotten about Beowulf is that it's actually not written by a pagan. Beowulf was written around the same time of 700 AD. It's sort of compiled, really. And Beowulf was written and finished about 700 AD, or about the same time as the Lindisfarne Gospels. But Beowulf is written by a Christian, an Anglo-Saxon Christian who has essentially two tones of voice when he's telling the story. On the one hand, he's somewhat ashamed of the paganism. But then on the other hand, he has this sense of cultural identity to the stories of great heroes from his tradition. It would be a bit, I suppose, like the way in which many Americans look at some of the founding fathers who were not Christians, people like Benjamin Franklin, a deist, and these kinds of things, where you can sort of be very proud of the national heritage of some of these great leaders. even if you personally have issue with the way in which they characterized or expressed their non-Christian beliefs in certain things. And so the Celtic and the Anglo-Saxon world is going through a significant amount of change as it becomes Christianized. What's important for the story of the Vikings, though, is the Scandinavians themselves were not part of that Christianization yet. In fact, the Vikings were still committed to the old Norse gods of paganism. And so it's worth just a brief description of what the Norse gods were and what the Viking religion was. When you look at the Norse gods and the Viking worship and sacrifices to their gods, what you see is parallels with the way the Romans engage with their deities. Now, of course, there are stories of Romans who zealously believed in their faith, but there are also stories of pagans who sort of went through the rituals just for the sake of continuing the rituals, or just to simply keep their powder dry, to make sure that the gods weren't angry, just in case they were actually paying attention. And with the Vikings, you get much of that as well. There is nothing in the Viking religion that actually should even make us call it a religion. There are no priests in the Norse mythology. There is no caste system of those who are designed to sort of stoke up the religious faith amongst the Scandinavian peoples. In fact, the worship and the sacrifice to these gods was really more a responsibility of all of the Scandinavian peoples individually, particularly when you match up the Norse gods with the military ethos. Now, what we know of the Viking or the Norse gods comes down to us from two main texts. There are a number of others, but the two main texts that are still read today and studied today are the Poetic Edda, written in the 800s or 900s, compiled really in the 800s or 900s, and the Prose Edda, which was compiled in the 13th century. In these stories, what we find is a bit of a different mythology amongst the Norse or the northern Scandinavian gods than you find in other parts of the pagan world. There are two factors of Norse religion that you don't really see in much of Roman or Greek paganism or in other parts of the world. First and foremost, in the Scandinavian mythology, they have a relatively clear creation myth. They have a story of how things came about. They also have a more coherent cosmology than you really get in Greco-Roman mythology. Now, of course, the Romans and the Greeks, particularly the Romans, all do talk about the location of the gods. They talk about Mount Olympus. They talk about the ways in which the gods ruled over certain aspects of nature. But that's not really a cosmology. That's more of a sense in which the gods are lords over things that the Romans are concerned about, like harvest or marriage or fertility and these kinds of things. In the Norse mythology, you have a relatively coherent cosmology in the sense that they actually have locations for just about every being or entity that they come in contact with. The other piece of the Norse mythology that is unique is they have an eschatology. The Norse have a concept of how the world will come to an end. So, first and foremost, the creation story. The story goes amongst the Scandinavians that in a time long past, there was one giant god named Ymir. Ymir lives in a deep ice cave, seemingly locked up in this cave, we might say. They don't explain how he gets there or how the beings arose in the first place, but it begins with Ymir living in this ice cave, and he is sustained by some sort of primordial cow who feeds him milk. Of course, this is the Scandinavian world. When it was cold, you stayed inside and your animals fed you. And the cow, over time, begins to lick the ice, I assume for the sake of water. And as the cow licks the ice, he uncovers the god Buri. And Buri is therefore released from his captivity within the ice. And Buri becomes the father of Odin and Odin's two brothers. And Odin and his brothers slay the god Ymir, and they use his body to create the world. And the world is actually quite interesting from at least a literary standpoint. The world is conceived of as a giant tree, Yggdrasil. And Yggdrasil is the sort of skeletal structure that holds the worlds together. And in the Scandinavian cosmology, there are 9 worlds. 9 unique worlds that are all attached to this sacred tree. And placed around this tree and beneath it on various levels are all of the places where gods and man and other beings dwell. The first that you come to when you move beneath the tree, sort of at the root level, is you come to Asgard. Asgard, of course, is the place of Odin and his clan, of Thor, of Sif, and of all of the gods that are the primary gods for the Scandinavian peoples. Now, there was a place called Vanaheim, which is where the old giant gods dwelt. But that is not discussed as much. Asgard is the central hub for divine activity. At this same level, there is Alfheim, which is the region where the light elves live, that is to say, the good elves. Of course, if you're a fan of Tolkien, this is going to start sounding very, very familiar. Of course, Tolkien was an expert in all of this mythology and in Beowulf in particular, so the fact that there are some parallels between this and Lord of the Rings is going to come to no surprise. But Alfheim is where the light elves live, and around this as well is the area of Valhalla. And Valhalla is something like heaven, only it is not a heaven for everyone. Valhalla is Odin's realm, where those who participate in glorious battle and die on the battlefield, half of them get to go to Valhalla, and half are taken by Odin's wife, Freya, to her realm. If you go to Valhalla, of course, things are good for you. I often describe Valhalla as sort of the ultimate guy's night out. Valhalla is essentially a giant mead hall where the spirits of these warriors go to live, and while there, they are fed by a magical pig, who every night feeds them from itself. And there's also a magical goat who feeds them with the most delicious meat they've ever had. It's sort of a, heavenly barbecue, I suppose. So half go to Valhalla, where they are to await the final battle, Ragnarok, which we'll talk about in just a second. The other half are chosen by Freya to go and dwell in her realm. And the beings that are responsible for going over the battlefield and for snatching up Freya's chosen half to go to her realm are the Valkyries. Those of you who are fans of opera, of course, are aware of Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle trilogy, and of course, the famous piece of music that many of us know, even if we don't know about opera, is The Ride of the Valkyries. Well, the Ride of the Valkyries in Wagner's play is just this sort of thing. It's after a great battle, and the Valkyries are coming to the battlefield, and hence the music of their ride as they come to select up which warriors get to go be with Freya. So this first realm, Asgard, Alfheim, Valhalla, and others, is really sort of the highest order of the 9 worlds. One level down, though, from Asgard and Valhalla, you have the realm of humans. It's the area known as Midgard, or Middle Earth. And Midgard is separated by some mountains from the Jotunheim, which are the enemies, whom Odin is always coming in to sort of keep at bay. And this region has others as well. It has Sva-Alfheim, which is where the Dark Elves live, which the Scandinavians believed the Dark Elves were the ones responsible for bad dreams, that they would come and sit on your chest at night and whisper evil thoughts as you slept. And near Midgard, or Middle Earth, is also where the dwarves lived. One level down from that, of course, and you have the region of Hell. And yes, Hell is the etymological origin of the word we describe when we talk about eternal damnation from the Bible. We talk about people going to hell. Only in the Scandinavian religion, hell for them is eternal ice and torment by being frozen for the rest of eternity. And the one last piece is there is a gigantic dragon or serpent, sometimes called a snake, but in Scandinavian literature, often a serpent is more referring to a dragon or to a worm, as they were called. But there was this dragon or this serpent or snake that it encompasses the world. It's an enormous size. And in fact, Thor at one point defeats this dragon and it sinks to the bottom of the sea. And it will come back, though, at the end of time to seek revenge during the great eschatological end of Ragnarok. Now, on that point of Ragnarok, in Asgard, you have essentially a monarchy of the gods. You have Odin, who is ruling Asgard as the father of many of the gods. He is often depicted as being flocked by ravens. Odin is a wanderer. He is the pursuer of knowledge at all times. In fact, he's often depicted with just one eye because he is offered the opportunity to drink from the well of the sacred tree of Yggdrasil. He willingly gives up one of his eyes in order to drink from this well to obtain a certain insight of knowledge. And Odin is the giver of knowledge to humanity, most often displayed by the fact that he gives humanity runes. And runes in Scandinavian culture are sort of magical alphabets that you would write on your swords or on stones out in the field that would imbue either your sword or other things with magical properties. And of course, Odin had a number of children. His heir was Thor, protector of mankind. Of course, Thor in Scandinavian literature is not a spoiled brat with long, flowing blonde hair and sexy abs. Thor is more like Fred Flintstone, I always say. He's large, he's barrel-chested, he drinks it up, he lives it up, He's a bit of the alpha male for the Scandinavians. Thor, of course, is the god of thunder, of lightning storms, both of which are very important if you spend a lot of time out at sea. And it is believed that Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, is one of his primary weapons. And in the Scandinavian world, often people would wear Thor's hammer as a pendant around their neck. And there are all kinds of other gods as well. There's Sif, there's Balder, one of Odin's son, who's married to Nanna, which is, of course, any of you who grew up calling your grandmother Nanna, that's where it comes from. Nanna is the god of all things motherly. Now, all of this cosmology and all of this mythology about the gods all comes down to an eschatology. And in many cases for the Vikings, the religious energy of their faith was driven by the fact that they were promised to participate in Ragnarok if they battled valiantly on the battlefield as Vikings. Again, those who go to Freya's realm and those who go to Valhalla are almost always believed to be warriors. You don't just go to Valhalla or to Freya's realm forever. Rather, you go there to await Ragnarok. It's considered to be the ultimate thrill to take part in Ragnarok. Now, what is Ragnarok? Essentially, Ragnarok, translated, means something like the twilight of the gods or even the death of the gods, the end of the gods. And not a few commentators have pointed out the unique ways in which the Vikings believed that their gods could die. That they believed that even though they worshiped them as pillars of strength and as deities that could shape their lives here on this earth in this life, they nevertheless believed that at the end of time, many of the gods that they worshipped would be overthrown by evil forces, but that in the end, even with the death of a few of their gods, the end result would be something of harmony. And the story of Ragnarok is complex. There are different perspectives on this, even amongst the Vikings. But the simplest story that is told is that Loki, the brother of Thor and one of the sons of Odin, though of course there's some dispute as to whether or not he is adopted or if he is actually one of Odin's sons. But still, Loki is the tempter god. He is the trickster. He often finds ways to pervert the good aims of Odin and Thor and others. And in the end, Loki churns on Asgard and unleashes Ragnarok. The first event that is said to occur before Ragnarok begins is the death of Balder, the son of Odin and the brother of Thor. And with the death of Balder, Ragnarok is officially underway. And a lot of events occur. We can go into all great detail, but it is not necessary here. Just a few highlights. Odin gets into a battle with some of his mortal enemies. The great dragon that Thor has defeated, that used to encompass the world, but is now sunk to the bottom of the sea, is now returned, and he spews poison all over the battlefield, and he and Thor lock in battle, and the snake does manage to kill and defeat Thor, but not before Thor has wounded the dragon enough that he too dies. And in the end, many of the gods of Asgard are slain. The few gods who survive the battle end up going on to make another paradise for themselves. And one of the great places that they build is another mead hall. And that mead hall goes by the name of Gimli. Again, another connection to Lord of the Rings. Gimli is the place where the gods who survive go to live. And in the end, Ragnarok is not only the destruction of the gods, it is also the destruction of the world. But the world returns. As the story tells, at the end, after Ragnarok, there are two who return, a man and a woman. And the couple who emerge from the sea have the responsibility to repopulate the earth and to begin things all over again. And this has led to some confusion or to some debate amongst even scholars, and there wasn't necessarily a clear answer in Viking mythology. The question is whether or not this represents some sort of cycle of time, as if Ragnarok occurs again and again, the human race is reborn, and the question is are the gods themselves reborn, or do they return in some way? And there really is no answer, but needless to say, at the end of time, humanity is in many ways left to its own devices. As the gods are defeated, at the end, humanity is reborn. Some have seen this as the emergence of humanity out from underneath the gods, that the gods expelled their final energies to defend the human race and to put an end to the evil forces, and that the rebirth of humanity itself can now flourish without the forces of tyranny and of nature and these kinds of things always intervening and stopping them from their destiny. And whatever the case, whether it's a cyclical view of time or whether it's some sort of emergence from out from underneath the tyranny of the gods or some other answer that we don't know, the end result is that Ragnarok is the thing that fires the imagination of the Vikings. When they go on their campaigns, when they go on their raids, they're not simply going out to gain loot, to gain material comfort, though of course these are the things that they're doing. But they are always inspired and they are always sacrificing themselves to the idea that what they need to do is to position themselves either to go to the Hall of Freya after dying in battle or to go to Valhalla to await the final battle of Ragnarok. And so the Vikings are not simply material comfort seekers. They're not simply going out for themselves. There is this religious pagan ethos that drives them to want to die in battle or to participate in glorious battle so that they might be found worthy of Valhalla or Freya's court. And for that reason, what they end up becoming is a serious martial force, a serious skirmishing group that has religious fervor within them that drives them to go further and farther than any who have gone before. A lot of the reason why they are successful is because of the advent of their own technology in shipbuilding. Over the centuries, they had developed a number of shipbuilding practices that lent a lot of advantage to their side whenever they went skirmishing throughout Europe. They had low draft boats that could hold many people. It could be rowed by oars. They developed keels. Sails were eventually put to great use to sail further and farther than they'd ever had before. And the result is that the Vikings, inspired by this ideal of Ragnarok, could go a Viking, could go a raiding all throughout Europe and even all the way down into Russia, and they eventually make their way all the way down to Constantinople. Of course, they make their way all the way over to the New World. They are able to do this because of their advances in shipbuilding. On a famous case, on Easter Sunday, the Vikings made their way all the way into Europe, and they sailed up the river all the way into Paris, and they conquered Paris on Easter Sunday. In other cases, along the coastline, they would skirmish, they would raid a village, they would raid a city, they would take what they needed, and then they would leave just as quickly as they could, long before reinforcements had a chance to arrive. And so the end result is that the Viking raids and the Viking expansion created this consternation throughout the leadership of Europe that had to deal with the threat of constant Viking raids. One of the things that Charlemagne and his successors had always attempted to do is, just like the Romans, they wanted to unite Europe under one banner and under one authority. However, with the raiding of the Vikings and with their expansion, they had to own up to the fact that they had no standing army. They had no natural resources that would allow them to keep an army, as Rome had, on the perimeters to beat back the barbarian tribes. And so as a result, early medieval kings and authorities had to figure out ways to inspire those in regions that were affected by Viking raids to defend themselves. And the main idea that comes up is the idea of appointing vassals, of dispersing the authority of the empire and of kings all throughout one's territories by appointing vassals who would have allegiance back to the main king, but who would be tasked with defending a region, and in return for defending that region would be granted lands and serfs and all kinds of benefits of being a defender of the kingdom as a whole. And this model, of course, is what we know today as feudalism. But feudalism was in large part a response to the Vikings, or to the inability of the main central government to maintain its own authority and its own borders around its wider, vast territories. And
feudalism will have a remarkable impact on Europe. It will change the culture of society. It will change the way people interact with one another. It will both inspire things like chivalry and knights and lesser nobles to see themselves as both defenders of the authority of their lords, but at times as rivals to the authority of their lords and potential usurpers. It will also, unfortunately, take the Roman slave system and it will crystallize it as the model of serfdom, that serfs are tied to the land, that they are unable to travel, that they are essentially slaves by a different name. And so the Vikings exasperated the reality that there needed to be a new governing system, and that system inevitably shaped Europe.